Hello, we're back for installment 2 of Flora and Ulysses. So if you remember when we left off, Ulysses the squirrel was vacuumed up into the vacuum cleaner, and Flora ran downstairs, managed to get him out of the vacuum cleaner and give him squirrel CPR and brought him back to life. All right, we are on chapter 6, and this is called In the Event of a Seizure. Well, he's breathing, said Mrs. Tickum. Yes, said Flora, he is. She felt a swell of pride. The squirrel rolled over onto his stomach. He raised his head. His eyes were glazed. For heaven's sake, said Mrs. Tickum, look at him. She chuckled quietly. She shook her head. And then she laughed out loud. She kept laughing. She laughed and laughed and laughed. She laughed so hard that she started to shake. Was she having some kind of fit? Flora tried to remember what terrible things can happen to you, advised in the event of a seizure. It had something to do with moving the tongue out of the way or stabilizing it with a stick or something. Flora had saved the squirrel's life. She didn't see any reason she couldn't save Mrs. Tickum's tongue. The sun sank a little lower in the sky. Mrs. Tickum continued to laugh hysterically, and Flora Belle Buckman started looking around the Tickums' backyard for a stick. Chapter 7, The Soul of a Squirrel. The squirrel was a little unsteady on his feet. His brain felt large, roomier. It was as if several doors in the dark room of his self, doors he hadn't even known existed, had suddenly been flung wide. Everything was shot through with meaning, purpose, light. However, the squirrel was still a squirrel, and he was hungry. Very. Okay, now this is one of those sections where it looks like a comic book. So can you focus on that so they can see it? All right. So he's looking up. It looks like he's lost quite a bit of fur. He's kind of sniffing. Who can say what astonishments are hidden inside the most mundane being? And look what he's doing. He has lifted the entire vacuum cleaner up. He's shaking it. Crackers are falling out. And of course, he's nibbling on the crackers. Okay. Chapter 8, Helpful Information. Flora and Mrs. Tickum noticed at the same time. The squirrel, said Flora. The vacuum cleaner, said Mrs. Tickum. Together, they stared at the Ulysses 2000X and at the squirrel who was holding it over his head with one paw. That can't be, said Mrs. Tickum. The squirrel shook the vacuum cleaner. That can't be, said Mrs. Tickum. You already said that, said Flora. I'm repeating myself? You're repeating yourself. Maybe I have a brain tumor, said Mrs. Tickum. It was certainly possible that Mrs. Tickum had a brain tumor. Flora knew from reading Terrible Things Can Happen to You that a surprising number of people were walking around with tumors in their brains and didn't even know it. That was the thing about tragedy. It was just sitting there, keeping you company, waiting, and you had absolutely no idea. This was the kind of helpful information you could get from the comics if you paid attention. The other kind of information that you absorbed from the regular reading of comics, most particularly from the regular reading of The Illuminated Adventures of the Amazing Incandesto, was that impossible things happened all the time. For instance, heroes, superheroes, were born of ridiculous and unlikely circumstances. Spider bites, chemical spills, planetary dislocation, and in the case of Alfred T. Slipper, from accidental submersion in an industrial-sized vat of cleaning solution called Incandesto, the cleaning professional's hard-working friend. I don't think you have a brain tumor, said Flora. There might be another explanation. Uh-huh, said Mrs. Tickum. What's the other explanation? Have you ever heard of incandesto? What? Said Mrs. Tickum. Who? Said Flora. Incandesto is a who. He's a superhero. Right, said Mrs. Tickum. And your point is? Flora raised her right hand. She pointed with a single finger at the squirrel. Surely you're not implying, said Mrs. Tickum. The squirrel lowered the vacuum cleaner to the ground. He held himself very still. He considered both of them. His whiskers twitched and trembled. There were cracker crumbs on his head. He was a squirrel. Could he be a superhero too? Alfred T. Slipper was a janitor. Most of the time, people looked right past him. Sometimes, often, in fact, they treated him with disdain. They had no idea of the astonishing acts of heroism, the blinding light contained within his outward, humdrum disguise. Only Alfred's parakeet Dolores knew who he was and what he could do. The world will misunderstand him, said Flora. You bet it will, said Mrs. Tickum. Tootie, shouted Mr. Tickum from the back door. Tootie, I'm hungry. Tootie? What a ridiculous name. Flora couldn't resist the urge to say it out loud. Tootie, she said. Tootie Tickum. Listen, Tootie, go inside. Feed your husband. Say nothing to him or anyone else about any of this. Right, said Tootie. Say nothing. Feed my husband. Okay, right. She began walking slowly toward the house. Mr. Tickum called out, Are you done vacuuming? What about the Ulysses? Are you just going to leave it sitting there? Ulysses, whispered Flora. She felt a shiver run from the back of her head to the base of her spine. She might be a natural-born cynic, but she knew the right word when she heard it. Ulysses, she said again. She bent down and held out her hand to the squirrel. Come here, Ulysses, she said. Chapter 9. The whole world on fire. Look at this sweet picture of her holding Ulysses. Oh. She spoke to him, and he understood her. What the girl said was, Ulysses, come here, Ulysses. And without thinking, he moved toward her. It's okay, she said. And he believed her. It was astonishing. Everything was astonishing. The setting sun was illuminating each blade of grass. It was reflecting off the girl's glasses, making a halo of light around the girl's round head, setting the whole world on fire. The squirrel thought, when did things become so beautiful? And if it had been this way all along, how is it that I never noticed before? Listen to me, the girl said. My name is Flora. Your name is Ulysses. Okay, thought the squirrel. She put her hand on him. She picked him up. She cradled him in her left arm. He felt nothing but happiness. Why had he always been so terrified of humans? He couldn't imagine. Actually, he could imagine. There had been that time with the boy and the BB gun. There had, truthfully, been a lot of incidents with humans, some involving BB guns, some not, and all of them had been violent, terrifying, and soul-destroying. But this was a new life, and he was a changed squirrel. He felt spectacular, strong, smart, capable, and also hungry. He was very, very hungry. Okay, let's stop there for tonight. Thank you. Tune back in tomorrow. Check out the other videos. There'll be a new one about the figurative language assignment. There's a new good morning one. And be nice to your parents. Okay, good night. Bye.